So now that we know and understand what a fractal is, let's look at the broader group of things, which is self-similarity. So self-similarity is a property of an object where each part of the object resembles the whole. Generally, this also includes multiple sizes. So let's look at two examples here. So the Menger sponge, which we've already visited, this works because every small part is the cube itself, just represented again and again. Looking on the right, this is also the same principle because every spiraling part of this green object has another bud spiraling from it. So at every part and every scale, it's still the same object. This is something that we noticed in fractals as well, and we'll get into how that kind of differs between self-similarity and a fractal. So jumping straight into that, what actually does make them different? These two aren't actually mutually exclusive. So think how a square is a rectangle, but a rectangle is not a square. Self-similarity is actually the broader generalization that encompasses a fractal as well. So what actually makes them different? One of the major things is that every fractal has a mathematical derivation. There is some mathematical expression that determines or defines this. That's why even when you look at a very, very small portion of the fractal, it still maintains its detail. Think things like the Menger sponge itself. Even if I were to zoom in on the Menger sponge, every one of those smaller cubes has essentially the exact same resolution as the bigger cubes. And the reason for that, of course, is because when you have math or a mathematical derivation or an algorithmic way of rendering something, it doesn't matter how big or how small that actually gets, it will always maintain its structure and resolution. The same is not true if you don't have a mathematical explanation, and we'll get to that when we look at a few examples of fractals versus self-similarity. And the last thing is the fractional dimension. All the fractals that you see are these never-ending sequences, essentially, meaning that you can get fractional dimensions. This is what lends itself to the unique and kind of cool spirals that you get or simulations that you get in fractals. Whereas in self-similar objects, everything is contained in integer or discrete dimensions, which leads to still cool results, but the result is not nearly as unique as you can get with a fractal. So with these definitions in mind, is this a fractal or a self-similar? Well, a couple things immediately pop out to you. Number one, it's the fact that every part of this is equal resolution, incredibly detailed. Number two, it looks like you're applying the same transformation. So in this case, it looks like you're taking a triangle, then you're splitting every side of the triangle into a different triangle, and then you're splitting every side of that into a different triangle. And essentially, you're changing every face to containing multiple faces. So based off of that, I would estimate that this is a fractal. And we can see that this is indeed a fractal. This is a special fractal called the Koch snowflake, and essentially every iteration splits the side into multiple sides. So moving on, is this a fractal or just self-similar? I think this is obvious, and it's just self-similar. These are Russian nesting dolls, and as you can see, as you get smaller, you do lose some level of detail. And the most important thing is it's only in the third dimension. As I just mentioned, fractals are able to maintain their resolution as well as be present in even fractional dimensions because of the fact that they're once again just math, which means they can spiral in and out. However, if you have a self-similar object that is not a fractal, it has to maintain its dimensions in whole numbers and integers. It also has a finite number of iterations. So a fractal can have any type of number of iterations because it's essentially a continuous process. Math doesn't stop. However, when you have real objects that are self-similar, it has to actually maintain a finite number of iterations, which in this case would be 5. There's 5 nesting dolls. And in the smallest doll, as I mentioned, you just don't see the same detail. It gets cruder and cruder. But the important thing is, or why it's self-similar, is even at various scales, it still looks similar. It bears a resemblance, so you can tell that it is indeed self-similar. And why is this relevant to us as computer scientists? The biggest thing is that these algorithms provide a way, or taking advantage of this provides a way to make a very compact algorithm that still contains large amounts of detail, as well as creates realistic images. As Anne already mentioned previously, a lot of nature is mimicked in these fractal images, and therefore using the principles of self-similarity or fractal nature can help us add to this. Secondly, the implications of this are quite wide. So texture synthesis is a big thing because basically from a small thing, you can generate very repetitive texture that also maintains its texture as you zoom in or out because it's just math. You can procedurally generate things, you can compress existing textures, or existing images based off of a fractal nature. Since you're storing it as math instead of as pixels, or just an algorithm to generate it instead of the actual packets and colors, you can make a much more efficient way of representing it and therefore reduce the amount of storage you need. And then finally, the realistic nature generation is a fantastic application because so much of nature does draw on this principle. If you even consider baby lions compared to big lions, there's some levels of self-similarity in those. Granted, not even close to what we actually consider self-similarity, but you can draw on some of these same principles. The implementation of this varies widely. You can go from iterative function systems to L systems. Recursive subdivision is especially useful for fractals. Most fractals are actually made using this just because it makes sense. It lends itself to this because if you have a never-ending sequence from math, that's basically the bread and butter of what recursive subdivision can do. So it just lends itself properly to that. So this is essentially a basic introduction into what a fractal self-similarity is, what the differences are, how they've been used, where we can see them in nature, as well as why this is so important to us as computer scientists.